The project basically aims to offer a critical analysis of energy transition strategies in Mexico and Brazil. From this presentation, I want to do something a bit more general and present the analytical framework I'm developing that basically aims to offer a critique of the political economy of renewable energy from a Marxist perspective. And I want to also focus on the political implications that might derive from PIC. Do I need to make people or to other people? No, I think it's fine.
Is this recording, right?
Yeah. No.
Yes, I think it's, yeah, it is. Yes.
Okay, cool. Yes, and beyond the specific arguments I might put forward about renewable energy, hopefully I also develop an approach and a method of thinking about technology and innovation from the perspective of capital relation to nature that is useful for other people in the audience and in the research group that are not necessarily on renewable energy. So hopefully there is a bit of interest for everyone here. And my starting point when thinking about this issue is the sort of contradictory assessments that critical literature is making about capital's ability to deliver the energy transition. So critical geographers have theorized the energy transition as a potential socio-ecological fix, by which they mean the possibility that the appropriation of previously non-enclosed natures, such as wind and sunlight, might basically solve capital's economic and environmental contradictions. So it might offer a solution to the double crisis capital is facing. And this idea of the appropriation of nature and the contribution to capital accumulation is also being pursued in more normative critiques that renewable energy is being that are being levied against renewable energy. So, for instance, many authors have highlighted the sort of energy and land dispossessions that people see as inherent to renewable energy expansion in the global south, and others have argued that these dispossessions basically are being driven by assetization and the appropriation of rent from these resources. And very recently, renewable energy has been framed and analysed as part of a wider turn towards green extractivism that defines contemporary capitalism. But on the other hand, people like Brett Christophers and Andreas Malm, so important authors within contemporary Marxism, actually question the ability of capital to deliver the energy transition, precisely because they say that renewable energy production is not a very good avenue for the accumulation of capital, and precisely because it relies on the appropriation of nature. So exactly why that is the case we will see throughout this presentation, but it's important to note here that in developing this argument, they basically build on some of the contradictions that even mainstream analysis of the political economy of renewable energy are already identifying. And people talk about a renewable energy policy paradox. And by this, they mean the fact that revenues for wind and solar generators appear to depend on the extent to which the grid relies on more expensive price-setting generators. So because markets are marginalized markets, it means that if the price setters are expensive gas producers, renewable energy generators might appropriate windfall profits, and this became a matter of political debate across Europe recently in the context of very high gas prices after the war, or during the war in Ukraine, and how some governments tried to sort of tax so-called windfall profits for renewable energy generators in order to sort of fund subsidies and for sort of vulnerable households and limit electricity prices. But the other side of the coin is that in more normal times, as the expansion in wind and solar, as the capacity in wind and solar energy expands, a so-called merit order effect takes place, by which the literature means the process through which, as there's more capacity of renewable energy, the grid doesn't necessitate gas producers to produce electricity. It's enough to just mobilize solar and wind. And because they have very low marginal costs, it means that the prices become very, very low. And this is the process that's called price cannibalization. And it routinely does send prices to negative value. So we routinely see negative prices in wholesale markets. And according to the literature, basically, this is renewable generators undermining their own conditions of profitability. And again, this limits or appears to limit capital's ability to deliver the energy transition, because it appears that investment in renewable energy will only take place to the extent to which fossil fuels remain operating in the electricity market. So obviously that is a clear limit to the ability of capital to deliver the energy transition. So this is basically where I want to intervene. I want to make sense of these contradictions that the mainstream literature identifies, but going beyond the circularity of cost, prices, and value that is inherent in the neoclassical framework that they adopt, because all these analyses are very much in the tradition of neoclassical and environmental economics. And I also want to sort of also make sense of these antinomies that the existing critical assessments of the energy transition are posited. So they both sides of the debate make their assessment of capital's ability to deliver the energy transition dependent on the ability of capital to accumulate and to valorize through renewable energy production. They both highlight the role of nature in this process, but they reach opposite conclusions about what that means for the prospects of capital. So this is basically where I want to intervene, and in my opinion, I think what is needed is to develop a value theoretical critique of the political economy of renewable energy production. And what I mean by a value theoretical critique and why that's necessary hopefully becomes clearer through the course of this presentation. So I want to start first by basically developing this analytical framework informed by the categories of Marx critiques political economy and applying it to think about nature, value, and the accumulation of capital in the renewable energy sector. So the starting point for my argument is the general contradiction that basically sets capitalism apart from other modes of production throughout human history, and is the fact that even though nature and labor are the sources of all wealth, capitalism as a mode of production is guided by the production and accumulation of surplus value to which only socially necessary human labor contributes. And this is something that is already present in Marx's work in Capital, for instance, and being reinterpreted and developed further by authors like Paul Burkett that have tried to develop a sort of ecological reading of Marx's value theoretical critique of the political economy. And this has more recently been revisited and highlighted as an important contribution by both critical geographers and political ecologists that are trying to sort of put value at the center of capital's relation to nature. And in debates about the neoliberalization of nature and things like that, the Marx value theory has come up as a valuable analytical framework. More relevant for my analysis, this has recently been analysed in more concrete terms by Elena Baglioni and Liam Campling from Queen Mary in London through the concept of natural resources global value chains. And they argue that natural resource global value chains represent contemporary capitalism's ever-shifting ways of organising and pursuing the appropriation of nature. And importantly, they argue that the challenges capital encounters in appropriating nature is precisely what drives their geographical, organizational, and technological change. So what they do is they put that contradictory relationship of capital to nature at the heart of their analysis of these global value chains and how their articulation changes both from an organizational, geographical, and technological perspective. And they build on the work of Jason Moore to argue that what drives this these global value chains is the expansion of commodity frontiers. Basically, individual capitals are constantly seeking to appropriate more and more elements of nature in order to gain a competitive advantage in the market. You can think about it in terms of producing more cheaply or producing more commodities out of a particular resource or for a given cost. And in so doing, they're able to valorize above the normal rate. So they're able to appropriate surplus profits. But in general, Marxist literature argues that surplus profits are not a very adequate basis for capital accumulation, in the sense that not very stable, in the sense that surplus profits end up escaping capital. And I don't intend to explain this in much detail because of time constraints, but if someone has kind of questions about what that means from a sort of value theoretical perspective, I can go into detail, but I think we will see plenty of examples about why that's the case and what that means in renewable energy production. And there are two logics through which these commodity frontiers are expanded, and I'll say a bit more about them in a minute. But an important contribution that Baglioni and company make through the framework of natural resource global value chains is that the appropriation of natural conditions in the production process bestows upon this production process a certain indeterminacy and makes this production process more uncertain. And that ends up threatening, or might threaten, the valorization of capital. And why is there this indeterminacy? Well, they talk about the challenges that nature's own rhythm and properties may pose to capital accumulation. And you can think about it, if you think about it in agriculture, for instance, the uncertainty that changing weather patterns poses for agricultural capital, the constraints that the sort of organic rhythms of growth of crops and the seasonality of production poses to its valorization. But obviously they sort of generalize this to sort of a more general argument about the ecological indeterminacy of the production process. And they talk about the ecological indeterminacy of the production process to distinguish it from the social indeterminacy of the production process. And the social indeterminacy of the production process, basically, they argue it just derives from the fact that the class relations that define the capitalist production process are conflictive and are uneven, and that generates a certain, again, indeterminacy and uncertainty in the process. Marx wrote at length about how capital responds to these. He didn't use this language of social indeterminacy, but basically how Marx responded to what Baglioni and company call social indeterminacy of the production process through the subsumption of labor. And this idea of subsumption of labor just refers to the tendency of capital to subordinate the labor process to its valorization needs. And Marx distinguishes two logics of subsumption. And again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to sort of describe them at length. What matters for the purpose of this presentation is that Marx distinguishes between formal and real subsumption, and formal subsumption is normally equated with the production of absolute surplus value, so the extension of the working day and the appropriation of unpaid labor time. And real subsumption is equated to the production of relative surplus value, so the transformation of the production process through things like the division of labor, automation, the introduction of large-scale machinery that increases the productivity of labor and permits the production of relative surplus value. Marxist geographers in the last decades have sort of tried to apply the concept of Marx's analysis of subsumption of labor to the other sort of source of wealth. So people have started talking about the subsumption of nature. And I argue that the subsumption of nature is a key mechanism through which capital responds to the ecological indeterminacy of the production process. And again, there are two logics in this subsumption of nature, and there are the two logics of expansion of the commodity frontier presented before. So on the one hand, there is a commodity widening, and you can think about this in terms of extensive development, so incorporating new elements of nature into the circuits of capital. And then you've got commodity deepening, and you can think about this in terms of intensive development, so intensifying the contribution certain natural resources make to the production process, basically. And it's important to state here that both in the case of the subsumption of labor and subsumption of nature, I talk about two logics because these two are never sort of separate. Then you don't witness in real life, let's say, commodity widening is separate from commodity deepening, because normally the production or the appropriation of new natural resources also entails process of technological innovation as well. And you can think about, for instance, in terms of the extraction of offshore oil, for instance, that is both commodity deepening and commodity widening. So what does that mean then for renewable energy? So an important particularity of wind and solar energy when compared to other electricity generation technologies is that they rely on the direct appropriation of nature. And by that I only mean that when you think about a nuclear plant or a thermal plant that burns coal or natural gas, they are transforming a raw material into electricity that's already delivered to them in a commodity form. So they can buy natural gas, they can buy coal, and they can buy as much of it as they can pay for, basically. Whereas wind and solar energy producers, obviously, they rely on appropriating something that's freely available, but which on the other hand, they can't turn on and off at will. They can only produce when it's available. So for neoclassical economists, they theorize this as meaning that renewable energy has zero marginal cost. Basically, this quote is illustrative of the general approach to this question, because they argue that the economics of renewables are dominated by the initial capital investment in technology, for instance, but then the sun and wind are essentially free thereafter. And that means that the operating costs are modest and mainly fixed. So because it doesn't matter once the plant is in operation whether you produce 100 kilowatts of electricity or 50, then they argue that the zero marginal costs, that renewable energy has zero marginal costs. And this also has implications for how they think about the value of renewable energy. This quote again is illustrative of the general approach. So they say, because wind and solar have very low marginal costs, they can be considered market price takers with an energy value that's equal to the marginal generator's production costs, which sets the price. So in the fashion of neoclassical economics, basically, the value of renewable energy is determined by the price at which it is sold. And this price is set to reflect the utility that users derive from this last unit of electricity sold in the market. And this is basically how neoclassical economics approach the questions of value and price more generally, but applied to electricity. But obviously there is a problem with renewables insofar as people argue that variable renewable energy technologies, and this basically means wind and solar, have a higher level of uncertainty and generate electricity only when and where the resource is available, and therefore their value significantly differs from the value of conventional dispatchable electricity generation technologies. So there is a problem with electricity in terms of how readily one can apply the categories of neoclassical economics to it, because in the language of neoclassical economics, electricity is not a perfectly homogeneous good. Basically, not all electrons are perfect substitutes for each other, because there are certain dimensions that constrain competition in electricity. So there are three dimensions of heterogeneity that the literature highlights, and this is a space, because there are storage constraints to electricity. It's very expensive and inefficient to store electricity, so it's very different to produce electricity today or to produce it tomorrow, or more relevant, it's very different to produce electricity at 1 p.m. in the middle of the day when there's a lot of sun, and to produce it perhaps at 9 when the sun is setting down. Economically, that is very different, and because storage is very expensive. Again, it's very different to, there's just transmission constraints. That means that it's very different to produce electricity, for instance, in Galicia, where we have loads of wind energy, and to produce it next to big consumption center, let's say a big city like Madrid. Very different. And because there are, again, transporting electricity across the space is expensive. There are losses of electricity. So that means the economics of it is quite different. And again, there are flexibility constraints that because electricity seems to need to have a constant balance between supply and demand. It means that it's very different to produce electricity with a technology that's very flexible and can respond very quickly to variations in demand, and one that is not very flexible and takes a longer time to respond. And this is something that's general to electricity. It's about electricity as a good. What matters with renewables, or the problem with renewables, is that because they rely on these natural resources that are free, but also not under the control of capital, they are particularly they're particularly sensitive to these dimensions. And people talk about three, or they have analyzed the sensitivity to this idea of three factors of affecting the value of renewables. Milstein et al., for instance, talk about a profile value difference, congestion value difference, and curtailment value difference. And each of them obviously matches the competition constraints set earlier. What matters for the purpose of this presentation is that, as you can see at the bottom of the chart, when the penetration of solar and wind, and particularly solar, is very low, and these are all the markets in electricity markets in the US. So at SPP, for instance, solar accounts for less than 1% of electricity. So these factors actually represent a value premium. So there are certain the solar energy is more valuable than the average, let's say, and we will see later what that means and why that's the case. But as we go towards the top of both panels, you can see that as solar starts accounting for more of electricity, provides for more electricity demand, and wind also accounts for more of that electricity, these factors become factors of value decline. And Milstein et al. Actually argue that as solar and wind account for around between 20 and 30% of total electricity supply, their value goes down between 30 and 40% compared to the regional average. We will see later in more detail why that's the case and what that means. But obviously here we're talking a lot about value decline, and we need to think about how we, this is in the language of neoclassical economics, but how should we think about these issues and these processes in the categories of the critique of the political economy. So I argue that from this perspective and within the theoretical framework I developed, electricity produced by renewable energy plants may have zero marginal cost, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have value. And I argue that zero marginal cost doesn't imply a lack of value, because one needs to analyze each of the use values that a renewable energy plant produces as an aliquot part of the aggregate product that it produces throughout its lifetime. Basically, the value of each kilowatt hour or each electron that the plant produces is determined as a corresponding aliquot part of the total value that is generated by the capital invested in the renewable energy plant. And this, in turn, is determined by obviously an aliquot part of the total labor that's expended constructing, operating, and maintaining the plant. So again, it is the labor that's involved in the construction, operation, and maintenance of the plant that determines the value of this renewable energy. And at some point, Marx argues in Capital that when one thinks about the valorization of capital, it doesn't only matter that commodities or a single commodity is sold at the price that corresponds to its value, but that it should be also sold as it should be sold the correct price multiplied by the number, which forms its denominator as the aliquot part of a whole. Meaning, for the purpose of this presentation, that there are two key variables that affect the realization of the value that's going to yield in renewable energy commodities. Basically, the volume of total electricity that one plant produces throughout its lifetime, and its lifetime normally is like 20-25 years, and then the average prices at which that those commodities are sold. And here I want to be very clear on how this is different from the neoclassical economics perspective, insofar as these factors affect the realization of value in those commodities, but they do not affect the total amount of value that a renewable energy plant produces. So let's think of a renewable energy plant that has its generation curtailed. So it produces in a year less than, or it produces half of what it could have if the output wasn't curtailed. From the perspective of neoclassical economics, they see this as a value decline. In my argument, this is wrong. The total value produced is the same. It's just going to yield in a reduced number of use values. So it's materializing a reduced number of commodities. So from the perspective of a single commodity, what you actually see is value rise, not value decline. But overall, the total amount of value produced is the same. So when neoclassical economics are analyzing, it's actually still relevant when one thinks about the valorization of renewable energy capital. It's just theorized in the wrong way. So what they see as revenue decline or revenue premium are actually just the monetary manifestations of this ecological indeterminacy of renewable energy production. So when the penetration of renewables is low, we saw that this was a value premium. So this represents a opportunity for capital accumulation that attracts basically renewable energy capitalists to invest there. But as that happens, obviously the commodity frontier is exhausted. So the competitive advantage is eroded, and then those factors become revenue decline or value decline factors. So from value premium to value decline. And it's important to sort of consider that this transformation from the value of revenue decline to revenue premium, from revenue premium to revenue decline, is actually determined by competitive dynamics that basically limit the volume of electricity generation, and that's what happens with curtailment or the congestion of the transmission grid that prevents some plants from sort of sending more electricity to consumption centers, and also limiting its sell price, and that's basically what happens with price cannibalization. And the two plots on the right here just show basically how curtailment has a positive relation with the share of the grid of both solar and wind. So the more solar and wind there is on a given electricity grid, the more the output is curtailed. So again, there is this exhaustion of the commodity frontier and sort of competitive dynamics of renewables undermining their own case for profitability. And the ones at the bottom shows how spot prices in Japan's main electricity markets goes down the more the solar accounts for a higher share of demand. So when solar is very low demand, the price is positive. When solar accounts for around 3/4 of demand, the price becomes negative. So again, price cannibalization is basically a function of increased competition by other solar energy producers. So that's the kind of general analytical framework that I developed, and I want to use it to basically analyze the contradictions, these contradictions that capital faces in its valorization through renewable energy production, and also see some of the solutions and some of the strategies that capital develops to try and overcome those limits. And one of the ways in which renewable energy capital has sought to overcome limits to accumulation and to its valorization that derive from the ecological uncertainty of renewable energy production is through commodity widening strategies, and basically sort of strategies to increase the formal consumption of nature by expanding and integrating new elements of nature in the circuits of capital. So this expansion can be thought of in terms of new electricity markets. And for instance, the literature has analyzed how in California, when the renewable energy, when the share of electricity that was provided by solar energy was very low, solar producers face a profile premium, meaning the temporal profile of production, basically throughout the day, was positively correlated with the profile of demand. Basically, in California, a lot of people use a lot of electricity during the day for air conditioning and things like that. So that meant that renewable solar energy producers were able to sell electricity at higher prices than average, basically. But obviously, as more and more solar energy capitalists saw this opportunity, the process of price cannibalization took place. So prices started coming down, and this profile premium became a profile revenue decline, basically. So again, this is how capital expands and exhausts commodity frontiers. But one doesn't only need to think about electricity markets as a whole. We can also think about locations within electricity markets. So capital may expand to locations that have resources whose material properties mean or give them a competitive advantage in competition. So in the previous analysis that we just saw with the other graph, Milstein et al. Highlight how in one of the US markets, in ERCOT, that has a lot of installed capacity in wind energy, wind producers normally face a profile decline. So because there's a lot of wind energy plants producing at the same time, prices go down. But he also analyzes how some capitalists started expanding offshore, where the wind patterns were very different to England, and therefore they were producing at very different times. and that again enabled them to claim a profile premium. Basically, they were selling electricity at times where it was more expensive. But obviously, again, more and more people saw this opportunity, more and more people moved offshore. And what happened is the transmission lines that are necessary to obviously transport electricity to consumption inland became congested. And again, these ended up turning into congestion value reduction. So is the logic of expansion and exhausting of the commodity frontiers. And what I argue is that basically renewable energy capital is able to temporarily solve the limits to its valorization and solve these contradictions, but only by reproducing them at a larger scale. And what this reproduction at a larger scale means in more concrete terms is that revenue decline ends up affecting a greater number of locations, both in terms of new markets and more locations in terms of renewable energy plants in the middle of the sea now. According to the literature, another or a key, very important factor that has compensated for this tendency of revenue decline in the last decades has been the sustained reduction in the unitary costs of electricity as a result of technological innovations. And this is the kind of classic standard story of, capitalist competition and making the energy transition possible. Some, not all, but some of these technological innovations can be actually thought as commodity deepening strategies that have enabled capital to harvest more electricity out of given natural resources. So basically, they have increased the how efficient capital is in producing electricity out of given natural resources. And obviously, I theorize this as a sort of strategies to increase the real subsumption of nature. And I'm going to discuss here some sort of innovation tendencies, and in both cases, these are tendencies that are highlighted by the International Renewable Energy Association in their latest report analysing the costs of renewable energy. So IRENA highlights a key trend in wind energy in terms of more efficient turbine technologies with larger rotor diameter and hub heights, meaning wind turbines are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. In terms of the height of the turbine, basically, the logic of that is that the further up you go, normally wind speeds are faster, so you are getting more and more resources. So this would be a commodity widening strategy. But the interesting part of it is that by making turbines larger themselves, so having the blades themselves be longer, this facilitates electricity generation when wind speeds are very low. And this smooths the production profile of wind energy, meaning turbines are less sensitive to variations in wind speeds. So this obviously reduces the ecological indeterminacy of the production process and is, according to Milstein et al., as a strategy to alleviate this value reduction because it enables the generation of wind electricity in hours that have a higher price. Similar things happened with solar energy, where IRENA highlights the increased use of solar trackers for solar plants. And by that, it means that solar utility scale solar plants are increasingly designed with a system that enables the panels to track the sun as the day goes by. And it's interesting because this is not necessarily a strategy that maximizes total generation, and is not, and in the technical literature would call these maximizing capacity factors. There are other strategies that are better at that, so you can sort of fix it by in a particular orientation and things like that. What's interesting about the use of trackers is what it does is maximizing revenue. So it maximizes generation, but particularly in those hours where prices are higher. So you're not maximizing overall generation, you're maximizing generation probably in the morning, very early in the morning and very late in the evening, where there's less solar energy production and therefore prices are still high. But obviously these strategies can counteract revenue decline only temporarily, because eventually this commodity frontier is exhausted. Basically, these technological innovations can provide and do provide a competitive advantage for individual renewable energy capitals, but only insofar as their adoption is limited. So only insofar as only some renewable energy capitals adopt this innovation, and therefore expensive dispatchable plants like natural gas or coal-fired plants remain the ones that set prices. This is what one of the authors that I've quoted earlier in relation to solar energy says in their article. They say that their analysis is relevant only for marginal additions of photovoltaic capacity acting as price takers, because they do not consider the impact of basically this innovation on LMP, meaning local marginal prices profile. So they do not consider the impact of this innovation on the prices at which people are selling their electricity. But obviously, eventually, these prices do respond to this adoption of technology, because as more and more renewable energy capitals adopt this valorization, adopt this strategy and seek this valorization advantage and expand the commodity frontier, dispatchable generators that are expensive are competed, and the process of price cannibalization takes place again. So again, the limits to renewable energy capital's valorization are overcome only temporarily, insofar as renewable generators still compete with dispatchable ones, but are ultimately reproduced at a larger scale because dispatchable generators are eventually displaced. So what that means, again, more concretely, this reproduction at a larger scale is that revenue decline ends up affecting a greater number of hours. So before it was very much in the middle of the day, now it starts being greater and greater portions of the day in the case of solar, for instance. That's it all, for instance, that earlier argued about the importance of technological innovations in terms of cost declines. They argue, they are quite skeptical about the ability of technological innovations to continue delivering those cost reductions. And they basically argue that this means that subsidies are basically going to be necessary forever with renewable energy production, because eventually, in their language, cost decline catches up with value decline, and the profitability case is just not particularly good for renewable energy, and therefore investment won't take place. What this means from our perspective is that renewable energy capital has addressed ecological innovations not only through has addressed ecological indeterminacy not only through technological innovations, but also through organizational innovations. And by organizational innovations here, I mean changes to the relations of exchange to electricity commodities. Because the reality is that most renewable energy is not sold only in wholesale markets, right? And most renewable energy generators actually have bilateral out-of-market contracts that provide additional payments. And those bilateral contracts can be things like PPAs with large private consumers, or feed-in tariffs with as a result of state-organized auctions and things like that. Now, a lot of these contracts do offer subsidies, particularly earlier on. There are some now that do not offer subsidies, and they aim to sort of provide a price that reflects the true cost of renewable energy. From the perspective, from the point of this presentation, whether they provide a subsidy or not is quite relevant for the argument I want to make. What matters is that they guarantee a sale price and often even a certain volume of electricity, regardless of where and when these electricity commodities are actually being generated. So it doesn't matter if you're generating in the middle of the day when electricity prices are negative, and it doesn't matter if you are producing in the middle of the sea where transmission lines are very congested. You're going to be paid a price that's agreed, right? And that obviously might not address the ecological indeterminacy of renewable energy production, but it does mitigate the impact of this ecological indeterminacy in the realization of value. And I want to quote here at length what IRENA, so the International Renewable Energy Association, has to say about this sort of ubiquity of these bilateral contracts in electricity markets. So IRENA argues that additional regulated payments, such as feed-in tariffs and PPAs, implicitly push developers to find locations where resources are abundant and to adopt plan designs that minimize costs and maximize generation, because obviously you're getting a price that's set. It doesn't matter where or when you produce. This drives down the market price of electricity, which in itself increases the need for additional regulated payments, while simultaneously leading to higher grid investment requirements. From the perspective of neoclassical economics, this is being analyzed basically as an evidence of mispricing, right? That basically evidences a disconnect between the private incentives that individual participants facing the market and the social sort of whole of system impact of their actions. And the kind of solutions that are suggested for this problem has to do with basically internalizing these externalities and making sure prices reflect the real cost and the real benefits of things, and so that private incentives of social outcomes can be aligned. Now, from the perspective of the critique of political economy, that doesn't take you very far, because what we're seeing here is not a problem of exchange, but actually an example of a general trend that characterizes capitalism as a mode of production, in which the general necessities of the reproduction of capital, of the reproduction of social capital, enter into contradiction with this concrete realization through the private actions of individual capitals. So what does it mean in more concrete terms, more specifically, more tangibly? It means that changes to the relations of exchange do not and cannot eliminate contradictions that actually arise from the ecological indeterminacy of renewable energy production. What they're actually doing is socializing these costs, and the literature has analyzed sort of revenue decline factors, but other authors have analyzed integration costs. So what in a wholesale market would be revenue decline factors, when socialized through bilateral contracts, end up being the integration costs of renewables. And these integration costs mean different things, and I want to provide just quickly 2 examples because I am aware of time. So a bilateral contract, for instance, I said, guarantees you a price for electricity, and you can even guarantee that you're going to be able to, or someone's going to buy a certain volume of electricity. But the constraints of the grid do not disappear because of that. So those contracts cannot guarantee the physical delivery of that electricity, right? That still depends on the operation of the grid. So the question is, what happens when you have a contract with an electric utility where you say that you were going to provide them with X amount of electricity at a certain price, but then you're not able to actually produce that electricity, generate that electricity, because there are constraints in the grid, and the transmission lines that should have transported your electricity from the Highlands in Scotland or in the North Sea off the coast of Scotland to consumption centres in the southeast of England, for instance, are all congested, and you actually can't generate that electricity. In the UK, what that means in particular is that the operator of the grid pays you for that electricity, even if you're not generating it, while at the same time paying for very expensive gas plants nearer the center of consumption. So it pays twice for that same electricity, because they had an agreement that they were going to buy that electricity, and it's deemed that the congestion of the lines is not the fault of the renewable energy plant. And Ofgem, which is the energy regulator of the UK, has estimated that the annual costs of managing these transmission constraints has risen from 170 million in 2010 to more than 1.3 billion pounds. And these are UK billions, so this is 1,000 million for, as Europeans. But still, it's a tremendous cost at the same time that renewable energy has risen. So this is what the socialization, of course, actually means in practice, because this is paid through surcharges in electricity bills that consumers pay. In the case of price cannibalization, these bilateral procurement mechanisms might also alleviate the effects of price cannibalization for individual producers, right? But again, these contradictions are only reproduced and expanded scale. So in the US, for instance, one of the key mechanisms that the government has used to support wind energy has been the use of production tax credits. And in 2020, when Still et al. Wrote their paper, most wind energy producers were eligible to a $25 per megawatt hour generated and sold. So regardless of the price you sold your electricity, you were given extra $25. That's a surcharge that you received, right? So what they say is, well, that actually meant that instead of generators only being interested in selling electricity down to $0, they're actually interested in selling down to -25. Because if you sell at -10, but you receive 25, you're still winning $15. So what Still et al. finds is that the introduction of these bilateral contracts make the problem of price cannibalization worse for the whole market, And he sees actually that the production at negative prices actually becomes a very conscious valorization strategy of wind energy, because wind turbines actually are generating at higher than average production levels when prices are negative, because no one else wants to produce, whereas for them it's still profitable to do so. So they increase production at those times rather than restrict it. So, and I'm reaching the end now. What does all this analysis mean, right, for the ability of capital to deliver the energy transition? So I've argued that the expansion of the commodity frontier towards renewable energy does offer an opportunity for capital to accumulate through the appropriation of nature, but only insofar as this frontier is not exhausted and renewables don't become the normal conditions of production in the electricity sector. So insofar as they compete against fossil fuel producers. I have also analysed how capital has sought to overcome the limits that derive from this ecological indeterminacy of renewable energy production through both technological and organisational innovations that eventually only reproduce these contradictions at an expanded scale. So from this perspective, it appears that the energy transition offers a particularly acute manifestations of the contradictory foundations of the capitalist mode of development of the productive forces of social labour. This is a simplifier of a general contradiction that capital has towards technology, and a general contradiction that determines the development of the productive forces under capitalism. So in the case of renewable energy, for instance, a recent article has argued that storage on its own is actually very expensive to deliver firm, reliable, renewable energy, but has argued that if you combine a storage with oversized generation capacity, so you have much more capacity than you normally need at the best of times, but then you curtail the oversized capacity actively, and you have an adequately managed and planned combination of wind and solar resources, you're able to take advantage of that eco-variability. So basically what appears as ecological constraints to individual private producers may actually constitute ecological resources of a consciously planned electricity system. And Shannon et al. Have argued that the combination of solar and wind resources can decrease the variability intrinsic to either resource alone. So there are certain social, going back to the language of neoclassical economics, there are certain social optimal outcomes that might be achieved. The question is whether they will be achieved through the action of private, the investment decision of private producers, right? And individual capital is competing to accumulate and valorize. So what this means is that there is a certain contradiction, right, between the continued development of the productive forces of society that the energy transition represents, and that comes into conflict with capitalist relations of production. This is my main argument here. That is the contradictions that this presentation starts with are just manifestations of the general contradictions between the capitalist relation of production and the development of the productive forces. The question is if this conflict and the solutions to it can be contained to the energy sector, or whether the solution to this conflict actually requires the abolition of the capitalist mode of production as a whole. So when Irina, for instance, is now openly questioning whether competitive and profit-driven markets may be enablers or barriers to the energy transition, and they are calling for state operation, planning, and even ownership of renewable energy assets to facilitate the energy transition at the scale and speed at which is required. And they're calling for a partial decommodification of electricity, particularly as it applies to renewable energy, and they want to separate renewable energy producers from the sort of thermal plants, because they think they provide different service and different commodities. So there are certainly movements in place that are pointing to modifications in the electricity sector that try to modify this relation of production only in this sector. But obviously, whether that can be the case is an open question. And we also need to wonder whether the specific material form of this electricity system that needs to rely on coordination, conscious planning, whether this clashes with the alienated capitalist social existence, and whether it carries as an immediate potentiality the necessity for the creation of a new society. Meaning, is Marx's classic argument that capitalism produces the class that is going to eventually overthrow it. So in this case, capitalism is also producing the contradictions that will eventually overthrow it, whose solution requires its eventual abolition. And Marx argued that the field of application for machinery would therefore be entirely different in communist society from what it is in bourgeois society. So I want to end the presentation kind of on an open question and a provocation to kind of ask, what would then a transition to a zero carbon energy system look like if we freed the energy system from the value determinations and the determinations of the law of value that guides the capitalist mode of production? What would a non-capitalist energy transition look like, basically? And that's the end of my presentation.
Oh. Okay, so thank you very much. We open now the discussion, and it's been, I think, quite deep presentation. This is part of your PhD, right?
Yes, so this is a bit of theoretical chapter and a bit of an analytical chapter. So it's kind of, yeah, one chapter and a half if you want.
Yeah, there is also like a lot of technical aspects that's not everybody might be familiar with. So, okay, I don't know, like questions, clarification.
I've got a question, but as Mario said, this is very technical in some ways, like both in the context of the research, but also in the way you are framing it and the language you are using, which is very much like grounded in Marxist theory. So I don't know, like for me, what you're saying is basically that this represents the worst of both worlds, because there is an inevitable degree of planning that has to be in place for energy production. You cannot produce energy in like really competitive markets. It doesn't work like that. On the other hand, you have like capitalists trying to appropriate that. But I suppose like my question is what I was missing from this, maybe like or maybe it was there but not very explicitly foregrounded, is what is the role of demand in all this? Like, it's all very much like a supply-based analysis, if I understand it. But electricity is produced for profit, but it's also produced for profit because there is some kind of demand for it. And demand is not, something that is, I mean, we may talk like, demand can be shaped but there's also a degree of indeterminacy in demand as well. I don't know whether that's something you might want to consider. Also because, we know like another way in which, profits can keep on increasing is by basically like growing demand for electricity. More, electricity is produced more cheaply, but, we demand more of it. Classic rebound effect and all these kind of like things. So yeah, that was the other thing I wanted to say. And the third one, maybe like it reminds me a lot, like what you're saying is basically like, electricity is this kind of commodity that, looks very homogeneous. Like, that what you want is is very functional commodity. Like, but I suppose that is what it was thought as well when people started to talk about bottled water. And in the end, we saw like, there are many ways in which bottled water is still produced. And you go to the supermarket and there are still companies making a lot of profits from a completely undifferentiated product, which is basically available for free. For free, pretty much for free. And yet, there are ways in which this can be capitalized anyway. So I don't know, there are not really questions, more like whether like, things you have thought about, or maybe there were things that were already in the content of, and I missed them. But yeah, like I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Shall I address questions one by one, or?
I mean, these are quite.
Yeah, there are three here.
complicated questions.
So on the role of demand, demand is very important. So I start with an example from one of my case studies, which I haven't talked about here. But during my fieldwork in Brazil, for instance, I was speaking with wind energy producers, and one of the problems they were facing was that the state was no longer organizing auctions to agree the purchase of electricity, because it was deemed that there was already overcapacity in the system. So there was too much supply for the demand that there was in place. And this lack of demand was a product of two things. One was Brazil had not been, the economy of Brazil hadn't been growing as much as expected after 2014. But because obviously electricity, the construction of electricity infrastructure takes its time, so there was basically a mismatch between demand growth and supply growth. But another important problem that was limiting electricity demand was a massive expansion of solar distributed generation. So people actually installing solar panels in their own house, which was reducing net demand quite significantly and creating all sorts of challenges in terms of managing of the grid, because it meant that in some cases, what was normally a site of energy consumption, like a city, was actually becoming a site of energy production. And in terms of managing the grid, that is a nightmare, because, well, the transport of electricity is not always bi-directional in the lines and all those things. So this is actually very important. Demand in that case is very important, because what that meant was there was not enough, the state wasn't buying or wasn't commissioning wind energy plants, and therefore there was not enough demand for the turbines that Brazil was producing at the time. And that basically, this lack of demand for electricity was actually impacting the industrial policy that Brazil had associated to its energy transition strategies, because in Brazil, the turn towards renewable energy was both a function of energy security, but also part of a wider industrialization turn in the sort of mid-2000s. So in this case, the electricity demand has consequences both for energy producers, but more widely for, if you want, the total accumulation of capital in Brazil. And you mentioned something important as well, which is demand might grow. And this is how we should be thinking about this turn towards electrification. So the energy transition hinges in very simplistic ways on two things. One is producing more and more electricity with low carbon sources such as renewables, but also substituting more and more energy uses for electricity. So electrification is a key part of the energy transition strategy. And that is obviously very important from the perspective of electricity producers, because it means more demand for their commodities, and in particular for renewable energy producers, because the zero marginal cost means that once you've got your wind energy, if you can produce twice as much as you have demand for, that's great, as long as demand continues. But obviously that doesn't negate the problems, the ecological indeterminacy of production, as I presented it here. So you would still need certain innovations that will enable you to satisfy that demand through renewable energy. Obviously, one of those key innovations is energy storage. So energy storage is being presented as the main way through which sort of renewable the energy transition might take place, and electrification also might take place. And in my perspective, and I haven't, sort of energy storage is kind of an afterthought in my own work, because basically in Mexico, for instance, it's only now being mandated as part of solar energy plants, and it's quite a new development. But in my perspective, that amounts to a very radical real subsumption of nature, insofar as what energy storage enables you to do is what sort of thermal plants already have. So thermal plants basically buy coal, natural gas, and then say, oh, I want to produce electricity, and they just kind of turn the tap on. Energy storage, in a way, separates the moment of nature appropriation from the moment of electricity production. So you basically appropriate wind and sun when the resource is there, you transform it into an electricity that you store, and then you can decide to sell that electricity when the price is more convenient, which supposedly would be when there's more demand for it, and therefore the prices goes up. So, and again, it really represents quite a radical way of dealing with that ecological indeterminacy. Now, what that means for the accumulation of capital is something else, because then obviously you have to take into account that this obviously is a huge investment, costs go up, more labor involved in it. So I would need to be thinking in the future, hopefully, about what that means. But yes, the role of demand is very, very important. And just to finish on your point about differentiation of bottled water, you have seen, and you see still, attempts to differentiate electricity for the retail market. So I've talked a lot about the wholesale market, which is the portion of the electricity market where competition has been more deregulated, and where there's more competition between individual capitalists. But in some countries, including the European Union, the retail market has also been differentiated, meaning electricity retailers compete for consumers' demand. And in some cases, that competition has meant retailers have really tried to offer a differentiated product, for instance, by claiming that 100% of the electricity they sell you is produced through renewable energy. Now, that is not true, or it's only true in a very artificial way. But it obviously is a marketing strategy, right? And insofar as it's effective for the valorization of that capital invested in the retail portion, but it doesn't really address the problems of the renewable energy capital that I was talking about, because basically that doesn't create new demand for that electricity, really. And insofar as renewables are already, because demand is kind of mediated through the competition in a market organized around marginal cost, they already have, they can already outcompete other sources. They don't need sort of artificial demand in that sense. What they need is to be able to produce more hours than they are producing often, and yeah, to be less constrained by, for instance, the problems of the grid. So to be able to transport electricity through longer distances, so they can supply to demand not only closer to where they're producing, but also throughout, Europe, in the case of Europe, throughout the whole continent. So the differentiation of electricity is interesting and important, but probably a different part of the market rather than for the wholesale market, I'd say.
Okay. Vida.
Go first. So I'm still trying to understand like the whole argument. Like you're using the literature from Marx and Marxist literature, but then you're using the categories from very neoliberal set of literature, like global natural resources, global value chain. That's not a like Marxist term for me to explain natural resources chain or global value chain. That's a very capitalist way of theorizing like natural resources. Like a more Marxist critique, or like similar to sympathetic to Marxist critique, is the unequal exchange of resources. So rather than using unequal exchanges of resources and like how it has impacted, you're using a neo-Marxist, a neo-capitalist term, and then you are using it in a Marxist framework. So, and that's why like I'm still trying to understand like whatever you are suggesting, like it makes sense, but these are all not theoretical arguments for me. These are like regulatory challenges or organizational challenges or some other kind of challenges, but it doesn't explain anything to me in terms of how capitalism operate at the most abstract level. And that is why I was like interested to see more from your empirical cases from Brazil and Mexico, rather than like the random examples which you have given from UK or USA, because market and capital and the relationship of market and capital and technology and everything like work differently in different contexts. So what is working or not working in one context might not be true for others. So I think first of all, like even Brazil and Mexico are not the good examples to analyze this kind of case. For me, the best example could have been India and China, where like whatever you are talking is already happening. So like already like not only policymakers, like the implementers are already working on storage technologies. So merging wind energy with solar energy, and the challenges of these things in terms of storage and transmission are already being discussed. So it's not like capitalism is behind capitalism, and they are all using mostly neoliberal methods or tools in one way or another. So they are already trying to address this question. The second is like transmission. India is already like, I think,
talking about international solar alliances, and they are already talking about transmitting energy from India to other part of the globe. So like big infrastructural investment. So like the challenges which you are arguing in terms of like nature subsumption, like these are already being discussed in other terms. So it's not like so the scale at which you are arguing, like I mean, that is not clear to me. Where is the capitalist, or like there are obviously different kind of capitalist systems, and even in India, even though state is proactively involved in many of this, but that is still a neoliberal energy transition. So there are multiple forms of neoliberal energy transition. In some neoliberal energy transition, which are still at initial stage, there are some of these challenges, but then like neoliberal transition is never about like a clear-cut distinction between capital and state. They always come together in different way to set the price, and even like how we theorize these things. Like water is a good example. Like in West, still water is a commodity, but you go to other places, water is not a commodity. Like when the public organizations are producing it, when non-profit organizations are producing it, and obviously like a big private corporation and different kinds of private corporations are producing it. So it's a commodity, but then it's more than a commodity. And that is true with even energy and renewable energy or any energy as a source. It's a commodity, but it's more than that. And like how it is being, how the price is being set is not only on the market forces, but many other forces.
Thank you. Okay, let me organize this. Okay, so on global value chains. So yes, so global value chains is a term that's been kind of co-opted, if you want, by very sort of technical sounding terms that have been used by sort of World Bank, IMF, and things like that. But it's important to remember that the origins of the term are actually in sort of world systems theory, in sort of global commodity chains approaches. In the case of Baglione and Campling, they adopt an openly Marxist approach, and they define natural resource global value chains using Marxist categories. Now, the global value chain term operates here mostly as a descriptive term only. I think that what is intended is to convey the idea that this is a production process that's organized across national boundaries and through different individual capitalism. For me, what mattered from the framework was this idea of how capital sort of tries to come to terms with the appropriation of nature, and how the challenges that sets actually has a lot of implications for not only the individual capitalists appropriating nature, but for the whole organization of the process. I don't necessarily see that as a sort of problematic descriptive device from a critical perspective, although there is a lot of, here I've tried to keep it sort of focus on renewables because I didn't have much time, but there is a lot of work around sort of Marxist approaches to value chains, some conversant, some not conversant with ideas of unequal exchange. And I should say that in my analysis of renewable energy, there's kind of two strands. One is the electricity market analysis that I develop here. The other is more sort of value chain stuff where I analyze things around industrialization and things like that. So I haven't done that here. So maybe if I had done that, it could be a bit clearer what that means and how it fits in the overall sort of theoretical framework. Now, why Brazil and Mexico, I think, is also part of the question. Well, I think Brazil and Mexico are very interesting case studies because is my basic assertion that the form that the energy transition takes place in a given country is a result of two determinations. One is the global determinations of the renewable energy industry. So, you know, renewable energy capitals might be, for instance, in the case of Latin America, for instance, the expansion of renewable energy in Latin America has a lot to do with the profitability problems that renewable energy producers were facing in Europe at the early 2010s in the context of austerity and the crisis here. So the market was kind of cooling down. So a lot of them started going to Latin America. So these are kind of determinations from the value chain, if you want. But then there are also determinations that has to do with the logic that governs capital accumulation in a particular state. So as you say, capital accumulation is very different across, and it works under very different logics in different countries. And Brazil and Mexico then were interesting because it offered a case where it's a similar region. They're both very large markets with relatively industrialized economies, but they took a very different approach to the energy transition. So in Brazil, as I said, it was very much tied to domestic industrialization, industrial policy, whereas in Mexico, it was tied to the production of cheap electricity. And it was cheap electricity to be able to continue reproducing the export-oriented industrialization model that characterizes Mexico and sort of maquila industry. So the sort of intentions of the state in driving the energy transition that were itself determined by the sort of overall needs of capital accumulation in that country were very, very different. And that means that the energy transition unfolds in very different ways in both countries. And Brazil and Mexico offer other particularities as well in how the electricity markets work. So Mexico had an electricity market because it's just undergone an electricity reform. But in the period that's relevant for my analysis, had an electricity market that is modeled basically in sort of Spanish and sort of US market. So kind of basically very similar to what I was analyzing here. Brazil is very different because Brazil is an electricity system that's dominated by hydroelectricity, meaning it's actually the wholesale market does not operate like this. It's not a marginalist market. It's basically prices are calculated on the basis of a sort of software that computes costs and things like that. But it's still interesting to see these sort of the problems that renewable energy capitals face are not eroded, they do not disappear because of this. So in Brazil, for instance, curtailment is still a massive issue in Brazil, and for instance, particularly wind energy producers are currently taking the government to court because their output is being curtailed and they're not being paid for that, and they argue that that is illegal. And so the issues that I identify here at sort of general level are reproduced in the case of Mexico, Brazil, but in very different forms, because obviously that's mediated by the particularity of both capital accumulation and the transition in there. So in the case of India and China, yes, they are. Well, China is very important for this analysis because when I talk about the reduction in price of solar panels, a lot of that, most of that has to do with China. And all the initiatives that you were talking about, sort of energy storage, large transmission projects, I mean, that they're also happening, particularly in Brazil and Mexico. What I would say is that to be able to understand the significance of that, I think these initiatives are significant insofar as they address some of these contradictions here. So, for instance, large transmission projects, and particularly transmission projects across countries, are a way of for instance, some countries tapping onto the natural competitive advantages because of natural resources and be able to turn it into export commodities, which in the case of electricity has normally been very limited because, again, it's very hard to transfer electricity long distance. So, yes, I think I would agree with a lot of what you said, and hopefully it will be in the thesis somewhere when that is written, but it wasn't here today in some cases.
Okay, I want to be super quick because I know I'll probably like to invite you for a coffee. Now, that being said, thank you very much for your presentation. I think it's a really interesting conceptual framework that you utilize to go through lyrics. I do think that part of the beauty is that your dialectic about your own categories. Now, that being said, I'm just curious. I don't know if this is something that you see in your case studies about where the capital is coming from. You mentioned a little bit in the 2010s that capital went from the European continent to global south. But for instance, and this is just an anecdote, so feel free to destroy me. I know that in my home region in Castilla-La Mancha, there's a lot of Chinese capital buying solar power plants. And I'd like to know if this is something you're seeing that's happening also in the global south. How are you making sense of this?
Yes, so I mean, I'll start with global north, maybe Spain perhaps. So as far as I understand, and again, this probably would be easier to explain if I had kind of analyzed sort of dynamics in the global value chain as a whole. But following Brett Christopher's, he analyzes the sort of how the renewable energy industry as a whole has responded to different profitability crises through an expansion of the commodity frontier, so going abroad, finding new markets, but also I would say through these technological innovations. And these technological innovations matter because in the case of wind, for instance, when wind energy deployment became global, that kind of made it very hard for wind manufacturing not to become global because there was industrial policies that some countries like India or China or Brazil mandated, but particularly where the bigger the turbines are, the more difficult it is to transport them. So you want to be producing those turbines in those near the site of deployment. So for a while, this kind of internationalization worked to sort of address those profitability problems, but eventually, as subsidies were removed, they came back. And before COVID, the industry was saying we have, profit margins are too tight, we're not going to invest anymore. So what's been happening is a centralization of capital. So both in the side of manufacturing and particularly in wind, the industry is mega competitive, but among a very reduced number of producers. In the case of solar, the centralization is lower but increasing, and it's been key for sort of the ability of Chinese capital to increase the scale of production and reduce panels. Now, in the side of deployment, centralization has always been smaller because it's an activity that it basically requires more knowledge of the regulatory landscape, the sort of land and stuff like that. So it was mostly mostly smaller capitals that were sometimes active or subcontracted by big companies, like Iberdrola, for instance. But this is changing now because what is happening is a lot of things like investment funds, pension funds, things like that, are actually buying assets from these companies. On the one hand, these companies need money because they normally have problems in the balance sheet. That means they need cash because they are too indebted, for instance. And for these pension funds, these assets are ideal because it normally provides a very sort of, not very high, but sort of stable rate of return. So yes, in the case of Spain, there's been the case of some Chinese capital coming in, but also German and Nordic capital. So there's been a sort of centralization of capital. In the case of the global south, in Brazil, for instance, it was a lot of domestic capital in terms of deployment, but in terms of manufacturing, it was tied to mostly Vestas, which is the big wind energy producers. And in the case of solar panels, there's barely any production there, but BYD, which is one of the main sort of electric vehicles, battery producers and solar panel producers, is active in Brazil in the sort of car manufacturing, and through that they're also active in solar. But sort of that's a sort of long-term strategy. In the case of Mexico, a lot of Spanish companies were very active in Mexico in the deployment stage. So there's barely any manufacturing in Mexico. There's some sort of assemblage, but very limited. And it was mostly US, because obviously in Mexico you also have very strong energy sector that's not electric through sort of oil and gas, and that means that there's ties with US companies, Spanish and Japanese as well, because of both interest in the sector, but also because of auto production, the sort of auto sector, because a lot of energy production was done by consumers as well through sort of self-supply mechanisms. So the specific actors that are involved in each country also have a lot to do with the specific insertion in global capitalism these countries have, and again, why the trends in the industry that are pushing towards the centralization of capital to address profitability concerns, basically.
Thank
quickly.
Una.
Thank you so much. In the beginning, I saw that you demarcated between what is that, ecological indeterminacy and social indeterminacy. And they're also at some point connected to the question of waste, for example. Because I saw that picture and it looked very dystopic to me. The solar panels in between little
Different,
spaces. Yes. So in your fieldwork, did you see the question of this social indeterminacy? Like you mentioned work by Yaneti, which talked about social justice concerns, and also Jennifer Barker talks about these concerns of waste typically. In your fieldwork, these questions emerge, and in what way do they feed into the overall analysis?
So thank you. I mean, my field work, so I'll start from when I started doing this research, a lot of the literature that was analyzing energy transition stuff on Brazil and Mexico were very focused on this question of dispossession. So there's loads of very detailed, very rich ethnographic analysis of indigenous communities being dispossessed from their lands through the sites of renewable energy plants. And that was kind of my entry point into this question. And what I started thinking, okay, I want to understand why this happens, basically. What are the sort of determinations behind this process? So I kind of thought, A, there's already quite a lot of research into this, and B, I'm not necessarily the best person to do this research because I'm not from this place. I know it less, and by training, I'm not necessarily perhaps an anthropologist or sociologist that would be better suited for that. I'm sort of a political economist. So my fieldwork was mostly with, I'd say, I guess what sort of methods literature would call elite interviews. So I was talking to policymakers, with people investing in these companies. Sometimes I spoke with some of the people operating the grid, and that was really interesting to see how there were changes to the operation of the grid through this process. But I didn't basically what you can see a lot of social indeterminacy in the case of Mexico, for instance, where a lot of wind energy has historically been concentrated in the Oaxaca region, where loads of indigenous communities have been dispossessed. They have contested the place. That means that a lot of projects actually didn't happen. More generally, you can see the social, at a sort of a higher level of abstraction, you can see the social indeterminacy at the sort of political level. So the former president, López Obrador, actually tried to do several times an electricity reform because it claimed that renewable energy was privatizing the electricity system. Also because he wanted to solidify the position of Pemex, which is an oil producer, and the sort of electric state utility, which relies on natural gas mostly. So obviously there was loads of determinations there, but what the social determinacy meant was that there were loads of projects that were cancelled because overnight the rules of the market changed. Then there was basically a very long judicial battle to see whether it was legal. It was deemed unconstitutional towards the end, and so the market continued operating, but obviously investment really slowed down because the regulatory environment, let's say, was really uncertain. And this has now culminated in the current president changing. She managed to secure majority for a constitutional reform that has enabled the transformation of the electricity sector. So a lot of, not all of that, a lot of the changes that the former president sought, but are deemed by some to be against renewables, although the reality is much more complex than that, are now being implemented. So there's definitely a social indeterminacy in the way that basically the implementation of these initiatives and the changes they also generate a social response, both on site in terms of people resisting wind energy farms, for instance, but also more generally about the political environment, right? And in the case of Mexico, the long-term decline of Pemex that was obviously at some point providing 40% of the federal budget, kind of combined with this to create a very sort of a politicization of renewables that perhaps you don't see in many other countries. And that is probably a very good example of the social indeterminacy. Perhaps if we go beyond the site of production and we think about the circuit of capital as a whole, but definitely I think that is something that could be done. Is that more or less what you were thinking of?
Yeah, partially.
Okay, well, we can talk a bit more later, perhaps.
Yeah, they will be with us this week at least, no?
Yes, yes, and probably
next
later,
week.
yeah, and later as well, yeah.
So it's, and it's from Boyle, so it's
From where?
from Boyle.
Oh,
Yeah, yeah. Despite the very nice British accent. Yeah, maybe I have last comment or question. May I? Or there are anybody,
Privilege of the chat.
anybody else? Or online? I think there's a lot of people online, no? No?
I can't,
No question from people online?
I don't think so, no.
So my question is about the China. So you say that's basically the neoclassic analysis and neoliberalization of the energy market is not working and has like some limits. I'm distilling, yeah, simplifying. So how China is managing this transition?
I mean, interestingly, China is actually now pushing for further deregulation of the market, although as always with Chinese characteristics. So it's not necessarily adopting the model that we have here. But the reality is that China combines, for instance, a trend towards increased competition in the market, but with also massive expansion of transmission capacity. So, for instance, a lot of the solar energy that China is installing is in the west of the country, quite far from the consumption centers in the coast. That had been limited even with lower competition, the valorization of the capital invested there, because they were not able to sort of produce as much electricity as they could have. But China is, I don't know the exact figures, but it's kind of, when you see the ultra voltage lines and ultra voltage are needed when you're transmitting electricity at very sort of long distances. China is like a world leader by far in terms of kilometers of line that it installs every year. Whereas in places like the US or Europe, it's tiny. So in China, you can see a combination of this competition with often state-supported investments in the necessary infrastructure that might make that competition work for them. And also that combined with often things like state intervention to make sure the land where the sites have been, the renewable energy plants are being sited is cheap. So there's as a form of subsidy. And again, subsidies in the production of those technologies. So
they have a planning strategy.
They definitely have a planning strategy for sure. And Xi Jinping has been key in this regard. He saw when he came to power that the reliance of China on imported oil was basically, from his perspective, a national security concern, and he's pushed for electrification, and as part of electrification, also renewable energy production, as part of a strategy of strategic independence. And if you see, there was actually the other day an article in the Financial Times that compared, it said whether, or it kind of provocatively posed the question of whether China might be the first electrostate, because when you see the rates of electrification, so the share of energy consumption that's accounted for electricity, US and Europe have stagnated around 20%, if I remember correctly, and China has sort of surpassed 30%, and it has been growing much more rapidly than the US and Europe, and that has to do with, yes, investment in infrastructure, investment in renewable energy, also electrification of transport through electric cars. So the question of electricity is being key for sort of the strategy of China, and particularly in the sort of new rising geopolitical tension scenario. I can only imagine he'll get even becoming more prominent in that sense.
That is why I was asking you to look more into India and China. Like India, according to Government of India figure, they already have achieved 48% renewable mix from in the electricity sector. 48% mix of the overall electricity production is coming from renewable, which is huge. They are producing more than 200 gigawatt of energy from renewable.
I mean, so for instance, in the case of Brazil, and I imagine India is similar, part of that is probably hydro. and then you've got solar and wind. But in Brazil, if you account for hydro as well, it's more than 80% of electricity is renewable. So, but then we need to distinguish between hydroelectricity and solar, at least from the argument I'm making in terms of the materiality of production and the impacts on valorizations. But it's very relevant. The particular mix in the system is very relevant for the way.
So that's why like India and China are like definitely like the biggest deployer of like solar. And Brazil is not in the same league because Brazil is getting majority from hydro. So I think like their move to go towards like solar and wind is also very different. Then those who don't have the same kind of like China and India definitely have big hydro possibility, but still like that hydro is still way low than compared to solar and wind. Because they also have coastal area and the natural resources and the regulatory and political will. Like in India also like energy security, energy sovereignty was one of the major narrative of the state to push for renewables. But when they are pushing for renewables, it's not like state-led, it is like neoliberal. So which is facing some of these like challenges, but then they are coming up with regulatory measures and other measures to tackle these challenges.
Yes, as far as I know, I think a key challenge in India, right, is the problem with access to land and the land disputes that renewable generators face. I mean, that is relevant everywhere in a way, but the importance in India is obviously interesting because obviously that has to do with the particular history of land tenure and land reforms in the country, and that sort of we need to think when we think about all this land conflict around renewables. Why? Obviously, there's if you want a physical element about the low density of renewable energy, also has to do with the particular sites that developers often seek are to do with where land is cheap, and that normally has to do with a place having a particular history of less economic development, things like that, and therefore all those conflicts arise. But yes, no, I mean, yes, China and India would be very interesting data studies to look at and kind of confront Brazil and Mexico against.
Okay. Thank you very much, André.